I read my first Tolkien book when I was 15, and that was The Hobbit. It impressed me a lot, and I enjoyed reading it.
Hello, you metal pilgrims, and welcome to the second episode of our Tolkien and Metal series. And yes, you were right, that was Hunsikirch, and that means that this episode is dedicated to Professor's influence on Blind Guardian. In this video, we'll explore the influence the world of Middle-earth has had on the Blind Guardian discography throughout the years, and of course get some answers from the band's co-founder Hunsikirch himself on what does the Tolkien world mean for him, who is the Sun Majesty about, whether the band actually was planning to submit a soundtrack for the Lord of the Rings movies, and whether they will consider doing that for the Amazon Prime series, and of course, whether we will ever hear another Tolkien-related album by Blind Guardian. But before we start, I ask you to support the project not only by liking and sharing this video to spread the word about it, but also by commenting with anything you agree or disagree about, and of course subscribe to the channel to help me grow this project. I promise to be releasing these videos on a consistent basis. But for now, buckle up, because we are going on a journey through Middle-earth with a heavy metal soundtrack. Here you go. I think you will agree with me that one thing that absolutely everybody knows, including non-metalheads, and the very first thing you usually hear when you start talking of Tolkien's influence on heavy metal and on that of power metal and Blind Guardian in particular, is of course Nightfall in Middle-earth.
Nightfall in Middle-earth?
Nightfall in Middle-earth! You see? Told you. And yes, it is true, you cannot really talk of Blind Guardian and Tolkien in the same conversation without at least mentioning Nightfall in Middle-earth. Yet, in addition to it not being the only Blind Guardian album, it is even not the very first band's attempt to incorporate the world of Arda into the heavy metal music. What? In fact, before we even start, let's make sure we actually introduce Blind Guardian for those who are not too familiar with the band. And if you're a fan, behold, for I am about to give you a piece of information about the band's formation that you've never known before. Well, not really. I don't think that there is anything new which I can tell at this point of history. Formed in 1984 in Krefeld, Germany, the band's first name was in fact Lucifer's Heritage. Yet, after signing with No Remorse Records, the band decided to switch the name to Blind Guardian. And by the way, I'm very thankful for that. The band did that to avoid any speculations of them being satanistic, and in addition to that, distance themselves from the rising black metal scene of the late 80s. You see, back then, most of the local record stores would in fact judge an album by its cover, or rather by its name in this case, and they would place the Blind Guardian's early demo material among the black metal band section. That was very misleading. And so the band, with the help of their label of course, decided to switch the name.
Alright, here's an opportunity to be creative.
And remember how in the previous episode I actually said that Tolkien fans, including myself of course, tend to look for and actually find evidence of Professor's influence somewhere where it's nowhere even near to be found. And so some fans actually believed that Blind Guardian named themselves after a character, some guardian I presume, from the world of Tolkien. They did not. The band's new name, in fact, was inspired by the band Fate's Warning and their 1986 release Awaken the Guardian. Fate's Warning, on the other hand, did have a Tolkien-related song. In 1984, and we spoke about that briefly in a previous episode, the band released a song called Shadowfax, named after probably the most popular animal of the Third Age.
Is the lord of all horses, and has been my friend through many dangers.
In order to understand the complex influences of the Tolkien world on the Blind Guardian discography throughout the years, I think it is important to understand how did it all begin.
9th grade, right? The obsession starts.
And so I decided to ask the band's founder, Hunsikirch, to answer a simple question of when did he first read a Tolkien book and what does the Tolkien world mean for him?
I read my first Tolkien book when I was 15, and that was The Hobbit. It impressed me a lot, and I enjoyed reading it. I was into fairy tales and into spooky stories around that time, but The Hobbit had a very special type of attitude, and I loved that so much. I simply didn't know about The Lord of the Rings, so it took a while until I started reading The Lord of the Rings. That was when I was 16 or 17. I was blown away that there was something even more epic than The Hobbit.
And so, with a new label and a new name, the band was in fact ready to release their debut album. And here is where the fun begins. Released in 1988, Battalions of Fear became the first studio album by the German power metal band Blind Guardian. And it both starts and ends with a Tolkien-related song. The song Majesty, the album's opening track and the very first song a Blind Guardian fan could hear on a studio album, references Gandalf, Sauron, hobbits, and so on and so forth. And thus it is absolutely clear that it talks of the events of the Third Age. And in more specifics, of course, the War of the Ring. Yet, since the song's lyrics are open to interpretations, and by the way, we have to get used to it because most of Blind Guardian's lyrics are open to interpretations, and that's what I personally love about them. There were a lot of speculations about who is Majesty? Who is the song talking about? Yes, it is clear that it does talk about Aragorn's return, but is it Aragorn who's referred to as Majesty, or Sauron, or somebody else? And thus, I thought that there is no better way to find out rather than to ask the song's author himself. And here is what Hansi Kirsch has to say about it.
Majesty, even though it was the first song which was inspired by a Tolkien story, is a difficult issue when it comes to explaining it. It refers to Aragorn, and he is the Majesty because of his legacy and because of what he's doing in The Lord of the Rings. I felt that very suitable. If I recollect it correctly, it is mostly Frodo doing the talking in the song, but also Boromir. There's one section which is dedicated to him. And whenever I do lyrics, especially if it's a topic like The Lord of the Rings, I expect people to know what I'm talking about. So it can be misleading sometimes. Even back then I was arrogant enough to believe that people wouldn't know what I was referring to. It is Aragorn and it is Frodo, and not every word which is in the lyrics is exactly how I would compose such a song today. For most of it, it's still a very suitable one.
Oh, and by the way, if you never noticed that, the opening intro to Majesty is in fact a sped up organ version of Johann Strauss's The Blue Danube. There are no clear evidences that songs like The Wizard's Crown or Run for the Night are talking about specific events in the Tolkien legendarium. Of course, I can make some wild guesses and build a hypothesis of it being about Gandalf or the events in Hobbit. You know, I do those a lot, but those will purely be based on speculations. One thing I am absolutely confident though, that those songs are for the very least influenced by the works of the professor, maybe subconsciously. Yet at the same time, it is absolutely clear that the final tracks of Battalions of Fear are influenced by the works of the professor. And you don't even have to be a Tolkien expert to know that. It's kind of obvious from the name. By the Gates of Moria is a monumental instrumental piece. And since there are no lyrics to this song, there is nothing really much to talk about it, said no one ever. My classical musical background, thanks mom, reminds me that this piece, at least in some parts of it, is a metal interpretation of Antonin Dvorak's Symphony No. 9 in E minor. Yeah, I'm that nerdy. And By the Gates of Moria is of course followed by Gandalf's Rebirth, a song which takes the same musical line created by its predecessor, yet develops it in a slightly different way. I don't think that there is much point of reciting the events in the Lord of the Rings book and talking about Gandalf's rebirth. Actually, there are not that many people in the Northern Hemisphere who, I believe, in the 21st century don't know about Gandalf dying and becoming the White after being the Grey.
Gandalf the Grey. That was my name. Gandalf.
Yet, one thing is important to underline though. In The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf dies after the events which took place in Moria, and therefore At the Gates of Moria serves as a dark predecessor to the follow-up, Gandalf's Rebirth. In the book, the death of Gandalf actually symbolizes the beginning of the end of the Fellowship. He was the glue that kept the entire group together. In addition, he was the only one who did have at least any powers to stop the ring's corruption affecting the minds of everyone else in the Fellowship. And that's why we see Boromir, after the death of Gandalf, not being able to hold it inside him anymore and attacking Frodo.
I ask only for the strength to defend my people.
With Gandalf gone, there is no much hope for the Fellowship. And therefore, there is not much hope for the world as we know it. And that's why By the Gates of Moria is a much darker piece. If you analyze the musical composition of this two-piece instrumental song, you will see that Gandalf's Rebirth, the second part, is in fact a much lighter piece, even though it takes the same musical line developed by its predecessor. It brings you hope, it brings you joy, just like seeing Gandalf in the woods of Fangorn brought hope and joy to Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. Therefore, we can say that in By the Gates of Moria and Gandalf's Rebirth, in one of the very first attempts by Blind Guardian to incorporate the world of Arda, the world created by J.R.R. Tolkien, into the music of their own, they were able to capture the essence and the atmosphere depicted in the book in an absolutely amazing way, without a single word. And thus I believe that Battalions of Fear, the debut album by Blind Guardian, both starts and ends with a spotless interpretation of the Tolkien legendarium. The band then keeps absolutely clear of any Tolkien references on their second album, Follow the Blind. And actually, if you don't trust me, take Hans's word for it.
On Follow the Blind, there is no song related to Tolkien.
You see, told you. And so if someone might have thought back then that Blind Guardian was done with Tolkien references, just like some Led Zeppelin fans, I presume, on their third album, they were absolutely wrong. The band was just getting started. The band's third studio album, Tales from the Twilight World, features several Tolkien references once again. But I guess the most obvious one would be, of course, The Lord of the Rings. Believe it or not, but the song The Lord of the Rings actually tells the story of The Lord of the Rings from the point of view of Frodo Baggins, who is holding the ring and going to Mordor with Sam to destroy it.
It cannot be.
So most of the song's lyrics are in fact a rewritten, a Blind Guardian version of the full verse, The Lord of the Rings. The voice accidentally heard and written down by the free people of Middle-earth, and so it talks about how the 3 rings were given to the elves and so on and so forth. By the way, did you ever know that J.R.R. Tolkien presumably actually wrote this verse while taking a bath?
Oh, it's so hard to care when you're this relaxed.
Before I actually say the next point, and before you start throwing stones at me in the comments, I actually want to have a little disclaimer over here. I love the song, and I've loved it for years now. But I think that there is a little something here that Blind Guardian might have actually missed.
Bro, what are you talking about, man?
And once again, no matter whether you agree with me or not, please do leave your thoughts on it in the comments. I'm one of those guys that thinks that any feedback is a valuable feedback, and therefore I'd love to start a meaningful discussion on this.
Write that down, write that down!
And so here it goes. Blind Guardian's lyrics in the final verse go like this. 7 rings to the gnomes in their halls made of stone. When the original line goes something like this. 7 rings to the dwarves in their halls made of stone. Well, that's not that much of a deal, you'd say. And I'd agree with you, if it was not for Tolkien himself. You see, in English language, the word gnome actually means a dwarf. Those are synonyms, we can use them interchangeably. And actually, in fact, most of the times nowadays, people call dwarves gnomes. According to Tolkien, though, gnomes were high elves of old in his legendarium. And therefore, technically, in a Tolkien world, and in Tolkien world only, not in a regular English-speaking world, Blind Guardian actually says that 7 rings were also given to the elves, which is not exactly true. Well, again, one thing that we have to remember is that this song is not a word-by-word interpretation of the Tolkien's verse. The band did not simply open the book, The Lord of the Rings, and send whatever they saw on a page. The band took a liberty of writing their own lyrics, and therefore Blind Guardian, as the song's creators, the lyric owners and authors, have absolute right and possibility of doing so, especially given that the word gnome in English means a dwarf. One thing that I'm kind of curious though is what you personally think. Did the band do this on purpose or not? I mean, they did have the original text in the book. Why did Hansi and the team decide to switch that one word in the lyrics? Please share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to start a meaningful discussion on that matter. The next song which we kind of have to talk about from the album is the song The Last Candle.
Guardian, guardian, guardian of the blind. Guardian, guardian, guardian of the blind. Guardian, guardian, guardian of the blind. Guardian, guardian, guardian of the blind.
Many, including myself, at first thought that this song is about Middle-earth. I mean, it talks about a wizard, elves and dwarves, so it gotta be, right? And while there is no clear indication of this song being Tolkien-related, there is a mentioning of the forest Caledon, and that forest is also mentioned in a different story about a wizard, Merlin.
Merlin, I owe you an apology.
Therefore, I'm 100% sure that this song has nothing to do with Middle-earth. But as always, there is a slight catch. In the second verse, Blind Guardian is singing about how forests will burn and how orcs hate green trees. Well, doesn't that remind you of something?
The old world will burn in the fires of industry. The forests will fall.
And this idea, the idea of destroying nature for the sake of meaningless industrialization, is in fact a running thread throughout Tolkien's works. Don't get me wrong, Tolkien was not against progress. In fact, he was all in favor of progress, the progress which would better our lives. Yet, he always opposed progress for the sake of progress. And therefore, even though this song does not sing about specific events in the Middle-earth history, I believe that it is in fact influenced by the works of the professor, maybe subconsciously. And a set trend of placing a song or two related to the Tolkien legendarium will in fact continue on the band's future albums. On their 4th studio record, Somewhere Far Beyond, similar to their debut, the band actually drops a 2-piece once again. Divided into 2 parts, In the Forest and The Hobbit, the Bard song becomes one of the most beloved and one of the most popular Blind Guardian songs of all times. And while the first part, In the Forest, does not talk about specific events in the Middle-earth history, its purpose is in fact a slightly different one. It describes the feelings which are evoked by those stories. It is a very personal ballad which makes you want to close your eyes and go on a journey through your inner self, similar to the way that Tolkien books make you want to do that. In several essays and letters, Tolkien describes the concept of sub-creation. It is a concept in which we, human beings, who are created in the image of God, are able to create the stories of our own, similar to the way in which we were created. And in such way, In the Forest is a sub-creation to the Tolkien world. It evokes the same feelings and prepares you for the second part of the song, The Hobbit. Since the band has placed you in the right mood, you as a listener are better prepared to consume the tale told in The Hobbit, especially given that the music line, which was created and developed in The Forest, continues on in The Hobbit, yet is transformed into a heavy metal piece, a culmination, a climax of the theme developed in the first part. In addition to that, lyric-wise, the band does an exquisite job telling the tale described in the Tolkien book without simply reciting the chain of events. And so I believe that that's about it for the Tolkien-related songs in the Somewhere Far Beyond album. And yet, as always, if I missed a song or two, please do let me know in the comments. Actually, even better than that, while you're watching this episode, think of your favorite Tolkien-related song by Blind Guardian and write down in the comments which song it is and why. First of all, that would really help with all the YouTube algorithms and spread the word about the project. And secondly, I'm actually very curious to find out which song do Blind Guardian fans consider to be the best one and why. And so at this point, I should finally be talking about Nightfall in Middle-earth, because I mean, that's why all of you came here for, right? I mean, this and Hans Kirsch, of course. And yeah, I'm not gonna do that just yet. There is another song which I briefly want to touch upon. The title track from Imaginations from the Other Side references Frodo, Sauron, and a whole bunch of other Tolkien-related stuff. And yet, it is not a Tolkien-inspired song.
Imaginations from the other side. Good enough, come on.
This is of course a speculation, yet I personally believe that this song is about childhood gone. And when I talk about childhood, I don't simply mean an age limit we set for ourselves, whatever it is, 16, 18, whatever it is in your culture. I'm talking about our ability to dream and to embrace fairy tales. And for Tolkien, for example, it looks like the childhood was never gone. And I personally believe that what keeps so many Tolkien fans hooked on that story, including myself. For some, it is a way to escape to a better world. A world without troubles, or at least with a different set of troubles. For others, fairy tales help to see the beauty in the world we live in. It is a magnifying glass through which lens we relearn to appreciate the marvels of the world we live in the way we're supposed to do so, which otherwise seem mundane. On the 28th of April in 1998, the band releases their 6th studio album. The album which today is considered the quintessential work of the entire Tolkien metal genre, and arguably one of the most influential power metal albums of all times. Nightfall in Middle-earth. So yeah, you finally made it. Unless you actually skipped through the parts of the video and went straight to the Nightfall in Middle-earth chapter, in which way, make sure you go back. You have to earn it. I mean, blood, sweat and tears. Yeah. And it is with this album that many fans around the globe started considering Blind Guardian to be a Tolkien metal band. But did they intend to become one? And how did it happen to be so that Blind Guardian wrote an entire concept album based on the Silmarillion? Were they so hooked on the story that they just felt that they had to put it on music? Or was it vice versa? Let's ask Hans Kirsch.
I started a band with Andre, and that was Lucifer's Heritage, which later on became Blind Guardian. After writing the first songs, we had one very epic song. This has been Majesty, and we both felt that this needed an epic topic. And around that time, I was also able to convince Andre to read into The Lord of the Rings. He also liked it. We discussed it. Marcus joined the band. He also liked Tolkien. And then we said, well, let's do a Tolkien song at the very least. That turned out to be Majesty, as mentioned. And yeah, it fitted very well. People loved it. We didn't think about it. You know, it was a quite organic and normal decision to do so from our side. When we did the first demo, and especially the first album, Battalions of Fear, people reacted very positive on Majesty and on everything related to Tolkien. So we knew we have found a perfect match, and we later on used that a couple of times, but not too often as people would think. For example, on Follow the Blind, there is no song related to Tolkien. The next song related to Tolkien was The Lord of the Rings on the Tales from the Twilight World album. Even then, we haven't thought about becoming the Tolkien band. It was just something very normal when, you know, the song sounded like an epic Tolkien-like music. We went for a story leaning into that direction. It was around 97, 96 when we did Nightfall in Middle-earth that we just felt, well, this is a concept album, and we were discussing possibilities. One of the possibilities was the Silmarillion, which I read around that time. And this has been the moment where we decided, well, Nightfall in Middle-earth will have to be an album completely filled with Tolkien topics. Because of the dimension of the Silmarillion, I then decided for the Flight of the Noldor, because that was the most moving part in the story, at least for me.
I'll be honest with you, I was extremely surprised to find out that Nightfall in Middle-earth wasn't really planned and written as a Silmarillion album from the very beginning. The music fits the story so well. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. As I said in a previous episode, the album consists of both spoken words and songs and tells the tales of the First Age, and in more specific described in these books. In Nightfall in Middle-earth tells the tale of the War of the Jewels, ending with the fifth great battle and a complete defeat of Noldor. And by the way, it is Noldors who were first called gnomes by J.R.R. Tolkien. Yeah, I'm a nerd.
Nerd. You're a f***ing nerd.
And thus, with the end of the fifth great battle, Middle-earth falls into the darkness of the reign of Morgoth. And here is where the name Nightfall in Middle-earth comes from. The album artwork, which by the way was created by already legendary Andreas Marshall, who's worked with most of the metal bands throughout his career, of course depicts Morgoth on his iron throne and with his black crown and jewels about to fall asleep. And of course Beren and Luthien dancing in front of him. The tale of love between Beren and Luthien, which is wonderfully described in this book, is indisputably one of the most beloved ones by all Tolkien fans around the world. And by the way, it was second to last book, which was edited and published by the late Christopher Tolkien, son of J.R.R. Tolkien. In fact, Tolkien himself loved the story so much that his and his wife Edith's tombstones say Beren and Luthien. In addition to the centerpiece, the detailing on this cover artwork is simply marvelous. The band and the artist went all in on depicting the weight and the gloom of Morgoth's hall, with walls made of metal and iron claws hanging from the ceiling. One thing which immediately caught my attention was the saw wheel in the back. For me personally, it represents the concept of meaningless industrialization, which we just spoke about it. And let's not forget that it's Morgoth, not Sauron, who is the original villain of Middle-earth. It is him who distorted the music of Fëanor and started abusing the resources of the world. And by the way, while we are on topic of Morgoth and Sauron, who do you think is that guy depicted standing next to Morgoth? Is it Sauron or is it somebody else? I personally think it's Sauron, but do let me know in the comments what you think. After recording most of the episode, and by the way, I got close to 3.5 hours of material for this episode, I realized that I need at least, at the very least, 3 to 5 minutes to speak about the events in the Legendarium corresponding to each one of the songs on Nightfall and Middle-earth. With 23 tracks, it will take me an hour and a half, approximately, at the very least. And I think that the episode would be utterly boring. I know what you're thinking. I'm utterly boring either way, so what's the difference here? But I think this would be taking it to a next level, even for me. And so in this episode, I'm not gonna debug each one of the songs from Nightfall and Middle-earth individually. I'll simply focus on some trends and allow myself to speak about one song. Yet, if you think that another episode, which will be dedicated solely to Nightfall and Middle-earth, when we analyze the musical composition and the lyrics of each one of the songs and match it to the events in the Legendarium, would make sense, please let me know in the comments. I'll be honest with you, the album's artwork depicts the events which happened in the Morgoth Hall so wonderfully that since then, when I was rereading Baron and Luthien, I actually could not help myself but imagine the events in the setting created in that artwork. And so does the music. Blind Guardian's complex musical forms, which blended several elements of different heavy genres, including, of course, power metal, together with grunt, symphonic arrangements, paint a vivid image of the events which happened during those dark times, starting with the War of Wrath, through the fall of Gondolin, and on to the fall of Noldor. At some points, you don't even have to read the lyrics to understand which stories a song sings about. Of course, the spoken word pieces, which are placed in between every song, help a lot if you do know the general storyline. For example, the opening track, War of Wrath, and the dialogue between Morgoth and Sauron serves as a great intro to the Fast and Furious into the Storm. This rapid and vicious track captures both the speed at which Morgoth and Ungoliant have to flee after the theft of the jewels, and the agony they feel after touching them. And the same goes for Nightfall, which captures the desperation of the world deprived of the light, and so on and so forth. With every track on the album, I actually believe that there is not even single one weak song on this record. And in fact, most of the musical critics, including those of the time when it just came out, would agree with me. But there is one track that definitely stands out though, and it is Mirror, Mirror. First of all, it is the only song which was released as a single. And the second is that I don't really know whether this song is cheerful and uplifting, or is it dark and heavy. It truly depends on the mood in which you're in at that point. It does tell the tale of Finrod and Turgon, who receive the message from the Lord of Waters and decide to build a hidden city of Gondolin to protect themselves from the disaster to come. This story is of course described in The Fall of Gondolin, my personal favorite book by J.R.R. Tolkien, and sadly, the last book ever edited and published by the late Christopher Tolkien. And I believe that, at least partially, it is the song's title and the main chorus which is to blame for why I personally don't really know whether the song is sad or happy. That the phrase mirror, mirror, which, by the way, at the very least, seems out of a different fairy tale.
What wouldst thou know, my queen?
In fact, shows the desperation and the doubts of the Elven king, who does understand that his city will fall, and the only true hope lies beyond the coast. Nightfall in Middle-earth is not only a Tolkien metal masterpiece, it was a huge success and actually placed the band in a completely different league. Let's not forget that all of this happened before 2001, and that means before Peter Jackson movies. And as I said in a previous episode, you actually had to go out there and read the books in order to be able to produce that kind of material. I I actually remember what it was like to be a Tolkien fan before Peter Jackson movies, when, most of the people knew what, Lord of the Rings is, yet at the same time looked at you as a weirdo when you started talking about Tolkien. But all of that changed in 2001 with the release of the Peter Jackson movie adaptations of the Lord of the Rings. And suddenly, the entire world became aware of who Frodo Baggins was.
Frodo! Mary, it's Frodo Baggins! Hello, Frodo! Get off him!
And you may like those adaptations or not, but it is indisputable that the Peter Jackson movies brought the Lord of the Rings and the entire Tolkien universe to the mainstream and raised an entire new generation of fans who now know not only of the Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit, they read the Silmarillion, the History of Middle-earth books, from the cover to a cover. And I believe that the new wave of interest is about to come once again with the release of the Amazon Prime TV series based on the Second Age. I am one of those guys who is both eagerly waiting for them and is truly afraid of it being a fraud.
So do all who live to see such times.
But several years ago, Marcus actually said in an interview that the band was considering offering their version of a soundtrack to Peter Jackson for the Lord of the Rings movies. So let's go ahead and hear from Hansi Kirsch why did that not go through, because I personally believe that it would have been amazing, and whether the band considers providing a soundtrack for the Amazon Prime series.
What Marcus was referring to is pretty much what you can listen to on Legacy of the Dark Lands. For instance, in War Feeds War, which was called Moria, or in Dark Clouds Rising, which was called The Shire, or in This Storm, which was called Gondor. So you can imagine in which direction the journey would have gone. And this, as classical music, would have suited the Jackson movies quite well. With vocals, it's something different, but the orchestral arrangements, they would have been what we would have supplied to the filming company back then. That was not happening because I was on promotional tour, so we missed the deadline. It was just a vague chance anyway, because everything was proceeding quite quickly with the Fellowship of the Rings back then. We were late in coming in anyway, so it's not a big loss for us, and I'm happy that we were able to, produce Legacy of the Darklands the way it turned out. And that took, as we all know, almost 20 years. So back in, 2000 or 2001, the songs would not have been in the exact same shape they are in now. And this for sure was better for the songs. Yet to answer the question correctly, no, we have not planned to submit anything to Amazon Prime or the producers of the new Tolkien TV series. I mean, they have their artists anyway, and if they were interested in Blind Guardian doing some music, they know how to reach us. So I'm quite sure that they have their stuff together, and I have to say that these score writers, they know their business, and it's a quite challenging mission for artists like us, who are capable in working in details, but never really had the opportunity to directly work on the screen, on the moving pictures. That's something else, and I don't know how good we would be in it. It's not the most tempting mission which I could imagine, I have to say, because it's quite a difficult job, and I like to, just go freestyle and do whatever Blind Guardian is doing, especially when it comes to Tolkien topics. But as mentioned, at one point there certainly will be music from Blind Guardian dealing with Tolkien topics. It depends on the music.
So in the beginning of the 21st century, after the successful release of Nightfall and Middle-earth, and enormous interest to the Tolkien world created by the Peter Jackson movies, millions of fans around the world actually expected Blind Guardian to produce and release another Tolkien-related album. Especially because they did say in multiple interviews in the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s that they will do so, exploring the events of the Second Age and going on into the Third Age. And yet, they do not. Preparing for this episode, I, in fact, went through the lyrics of all of the follow-up albums up to Nightfall and Middle-earth, and I, believe it or not, did not find any clear Tolkien references. Again, as a Tolkien nerd, I can make some wild assumptions and find the Tolkien reference even if it's nowhere even near to be there, but I will not do that. And so if I am wrong, and you actually think that there are songs which are related to the Tolkien world, please do let us know in the comments. I'm very, very curious to find out. But instead, the band decided to go their own path and create their own stories. And the culmination, the climax of this work is in fact concentrated in Blind Guardian Twilight Orchestra's 2019 release, Legacy of the Dark Lands. We in fact know for sure that Legacy of the Dark Lands is what the next Tolkien chapter would have sounded if the band decided to go through with it. But the question still remains, will Blind Guardian fans ever see and hear another band's adaptation of a Tolkien book, especially now with the release of Amazon Prime TV series and rising interest to the world of Arda once again? Let's ask Hansi Kirsch.
Yeah, I heard about the series, I have to say, but I really have no clue in which direction this is going to be, and therefore I doubt that this will be something inspiring. We have not been asked to, provide music for it. Whatever they do will be suitable, I'm pretty sure. And if it's about the Silmarillion and about the flight of the Noldor and most probably about the Curse of Fëanor, that is a quite challenging idea, but I like the idea and I believe that this is going to be probably the best series ever in TV history, but we will see. Maybe it is completely bullshit, I cannot say. It for sure will not be as inspiring as a book is. Legacy of the Darklands, yeah, that's true. That could have become a Tolkien-related album, but because we have developed so much over the years, we finally decided to go into other direction. This is also related to the simple fact that there is too much traffic around Tolkien topics when it comes to movies and whatever. It became mainstream at a certain point, especially with the Peter Jackson movies, which I like a lot. But it was not as tempting for us to, continue that direction because of that. If things silence, it is very possible that we go back and do something about Tolkien-related topics. But at the moment, nothing like that is planned. What I can say about the Legacy of the Dark Lands, for a short amount of time we thought about dedicating this to the Lord of the Rings directly. We then just, changed the idea. There was a roadmap already designed, but when we continued songwriting, we just decided to go into other directions to liberate that a little bit from Tolkien topics. But it's tempting to do so. Right at the moment, we are working on individual songs, so it would not make sense to dedicate an album which is filled with individual songs to a concept going into the flight of the Noldor direction or any other Tolkien direction, because it's epic stuff and it needs a certain handwriting in the songwriting already. And if that is given, then I for sure consider that to be an option, but nothing like that is planned, as said before.
And so it looks like in a couple of years we might have to create a new episode just to update the Tolkien-related Blind Guardian discography. But in the meanwhile, there are two things which we should do. Number one is you can write down in the comments whether I should create that special Nightfall in Middle-earth episode in which we will take a look at the composition of each one of the songs on the album and match it with the events in the Tolkien Legendarium. And while you're there, don't forget to write down your favorite Tolkien-related Blind Guardian song. I'm really curious to find out which one will win. And number two is, of course, submit the next band for the Tolkien and Metal series. I'd also like to say special thanks to the Nuclear Blast and especially Leonie Dovedat, who was extremely helpful in getting those answers from Hansi, the Tolkien Society for the amazing work they do and for all the information which is available for all Tolkien Society members, and of course to Hansi Kirsch himself for submitting those amazing detailed answers to all the questions which I personally did not know the answers to. Please do not forget to like this video and share it to spread the word. But more importantly, please do not forget to subscribe to the channel to help me grow this project. I promise to be releasing these videos on a much more consistent basis. Keep rocking!